right. Hi, my name is Michelle Helt. I am the 2018 Nebraska Teacher of the Year. I was also a teacher for 19 years in a classroom, and about 3 years ago decided to make the switch and joined our state education agency to work with adults and leadership teams. As you can see, I am an educator, a lifelong learner, and I'm always a little cautious to put in there a data enthusiast. So I like to give a little caveat with that. I think data is amazing. It can do a lot of great things, but I think there's also lots of different types of data. So I'm not one that just looks at the numbers and goes from that. I know there are a lot of places that we can find data, but it's all very useful when we look at working with students. So my goals for today are why isn't this going? There we go. We are going to be talking a little bit about MTSS and the impact it can have on student achievement. Also talking about MTSS, the PLC process, and teacher retention and how that's all connected. And finally, I'm hoping you can leave with some ideas on how you can implement MTSS or maybe even improve it in your buildings when we are done today. So the pendulum, back and forth and back and forth. And I just want to say MTSS is not one of the pendulum swinging ideas. It is not going to go away. It is truly meant to improve student achievement along with the PLC process. These are form processes and systems that are in place to help students achieve. So please do not write this off as another thing that will come and go. It truly is intended to be here long term and to help students. So I always like to ground what I'm doing in some sort of research and to have data to support it. The effect size, if we're looking at RTI. So RTI, response to intervention, and MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, are often used interchangeably. RTI tends to have a more of a narrow focus, often focusing on behavior, whereas MTSS focuses on behavior academics. So it's a little bit more of a broader, but they can be used interchangeably if you don't mind getting kind of caught in that web of, he can take that out, right? Okay, carry on.
It'll be fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So RTI, the effect size of RTI is 1.01, which we know that anything 0.4 and above, 0.4 is our average growth. Anything beyond that is considered a zone of desired effect. We want our students, we want to be able to put things in place that are going to have the biggest impact on our students. MTSS is one of those things. So MTSS, what is it? MTSS is something that is equitable. It provides equity to all of our students in a school building. It does not matter their socioeconomic background. It doesn't matter if they are on an IEP or not. It is meant to provide equity to every student. It also provides, it's a systematic way of looking at students. Sometimes I think this is a piece that gets missed in our schools. We find little holes, we try to patch that. We find a problem here, we try to fix it. This gives you a system to work through to ensure that every single kid is getting looked at least 3 times a year to ensure that they're not falling through the cracks. So this is a really powerful piece with that. And finally, it is data driven. So I taught for 19 years. I know the power of the teacher heart. I know the power of teacher observations. I also know sometimes that can be skewed, whether you realize it or not. So taking that into account. Thank you. Taking that into account.
A long day.
And I am so sorry.
You're working all day. It's okay. I'm here to help.
So taking into account those other pieces of data, you're going to use that to drive what you're doing with students. So everything you're doing with students is going to be grounded in some piece of data to move those students forward. So the American Institute for Research gives us a definition of MTSS, and the parts I really want to focus on, we have here highlighted in red. So MTSS is a framework that uses data and instruction to maximize student achievement. So again, it's that process in place to make sure no students are getting through the cracks, and we are making sure students are getting what they truly need when they need it. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 3 tiers of MTSS. It's really important to understand this is kind of like a living, breathing document, if you will. Students will move in between. This is not a place, rather it's the process that we go through to get kids what they need. So we don't put a kid in, for example, in a tier 3 and just leave them. They're tier 3. That's not how it works. And it can move. It's meant to be very fluid, and students are intended, we would hope they would move between tiers easily. So when we look at that tier 1, you'll notice it's the biggest part of our triangle. It is the universal tier. This is the tier that every student will get regardless of their academic needs. So even if they're on an IEP, it is still imperative that they are in on that tier 1 instruction. And it's also very important that tier 1 has high quality instructional material embedded in it. So this is where we start looking at, do we have a quality math curriculum? Does it follow best practice? Is it aligned with those standards we really want kids to meet? And it kind of eliminates the pulling of different things, filling your curriculum with teacher pay teacher or the cute little thing you found on Pinterest, which you could pull in some things and do that. I'm not opposed to having kids having fun, but we also need a systematic way of looking and a scope and ski sequence for the content. So tier 1, I cannot overstate how important it is for students to have access to tier 1 and to also have access to that quality instruction and materials. In tier 1, 80 to 90% of our students should be successful. So whatever you're teaching, we are hopeful that between 80 to 90% are learning that content. If they are not, if it's less than 80%, that should be your first red flag. There's something wrong with our universal instruction. And that doesn't mean, oh, we have a bad teacher. Oftentimes it goes back to the material and the scope and sequence and making sure it's aligned with those standards that we want students to know. So tier 1, we want to get all of our kids exposed, and if it's quality, we should have 80 to 90% of our kids successful at that level. Okay. I always like to bring in some sort of a story. So I'm super proud of this. This is my philodendron. I love gardening. I love doing stuff outside. For some reason, I kill every house plant that I've ever seen. But this philodendron came from my grandfather's funeral 22 years ago. Proof that it is easy to keep alive, right? So every single plant or majority of plants need all of the same things. They need water, they need sunlight, they need nutrients, they need soil, just like our students. They all need exposure to high quality instruction, high quality materials, the content standards. They all are like a plant. Every single one of them needs exposure to that. So I'm going to show you tier 2, and then we'll talk a little bit more about our plants. So tier 2, this is the tier where we have targeted instruction. So students have went through tier 1, they've been exposed to it. And in the meantime we do a screener. So what we do is we throw out this wide net. We have all students take this short screener or assessment. It should not be laborious. It shouldn't be time intensive. It's really kind of throwing out a net, seeing where are the gaps. Do we have kids that aren't on grade level? If we do, these kids will need to have a tier 2 intervention. So they're going to need some support to fill in those learning gaps that might be preventing them from being successful on grade level content. Also at this level, there are a couple of different ways you can look at it. All students get a universal screener. As far as a diagnostic, that's something that we would give students. We noticed, oh, they popped up on our screening results. There's a gap. Some people would say you do an intervention right away and then you do a diagnostic. I'm in the camp of, golly, if I'm going to do an intervention, I better make sure that it's working and it's targeting what they really need. So I would suggest doing some sort of a diagnostic to drill down and look at the skills that those students might be missing so that you know that the intervention that you've put into place is working or the student will be successful. Targeted intervention, it's a small group. It's 4, maybe 6 kids. If we look at What Works Clearinghouse, the IES practice guide, their research tells us that if we're doing an intervention, it should be targeted, explicit, systematic. Okay, we have to follow some sort of a system. We can't just pull. And if you're like me, when I did intervention in my classroom, before I knew better, I would just maybe do more of the same because let's be honest, tier 1, I was doing the best I could do anyway. It's not like I saved it for my tier 2 kids. So I did the best I could do in tier 1. And I'm thinking, I don't have any other processes in place. Okay, we'll just keep practicing what I did in tier 1. Well, clearly that didn't work. So we have to find a way to intervene that is systematic and very targeted to student needs. It also requires progress monitoring. So like I said earlier, they don't live in tier 2. Students don't live in a tier. Once we progress monitor and they're showing progress, the gap is closing, they are proficient at the skills, then they no longer need a targeted intervention and they can just move back to just being in tier 1 and not getting an intervention at that time. We know that in tier 2, this should be 10 to 15% of our students. If it's bigger than that, if you have 30, 40, 50% of your kids that need an intervention, big red flag. Something's wrong with tier 1. So if we have a lot of kids moving up to intervention, that means something's weak in our tier 1 instruction. So the recommendation, it's not we're not doing our interventions well. It's we cannot intervene our way out of poor tier 1 instruction. So we better go back, fix our tier 1, and then we can start looking at those targeted interventions. So here's my plant story again. So if you are using a fern, just like my philodendron, it needs sunlight, water, soil, nutrients. But ferns are just a little bit finickier. They like to be misted with water. They like indirect sunlight. I know this because I tried to have it in my house and it just burned up because I put it in the wrong window. So much like students, sometimes they need all the things that everybody else needs, and sometimes they just need something a little bit different. It doesn't take a lot to miss the plant, to maybe, like with a student, maybe put them in a small group for a few weeks, progress monitor. Oh, they're doing great. They're going to go back down to tier 1. So it shows us all the students are the same. They just might need a little something different.
I'm glad you said we didn't have to mist them, because that
No, please don't miss them. No.
that could get someone in trouble. But
No misting. Okay, so that brings us to tier 3. And if you notice, it is the smallest part of our triangle. Tier 3 is where the intensive interventions are happening. Typically, we have a student, we did the screener, it showed some gaps, we did an intervention, we did a targeted intervention, and then we notice with that progress monitoring, there's a lack of growth. Somewhere something is still not connecting with that student. And there are a couple of reasons that might be happening. It might be because of the fidelity of the intervention. So let's say you're doing an intervention program and it says you need to meet 4 days a week for 20 minutes. Again, I know what the classroom is like. If you put your intervention at the end of the day and it's anytime near football or basketball season, guaranteed you're probably going to have some sort of a pep assembly on a Friday. Oop, that gets shortened. If it's snowing out, oop, we let out early, that gets shortened. Oh, we got an extra recess. Oh, we had birthday treats. And all of a sudden, you're looking at 4 weeks of interventions, and maybe you've only seen that kid twice a week for 20 minutes. So we need to look back. And again, there's no finger pointing, there's no blame. It's just saying, why didn't it work? And if it's because of the way it was implemented, that would, to me, would mean maybe we need to move our intervention time, or maybe it needs to be longer or shorter. So there's a couple of different ways you can look at it. If there's lack of growth, check and make sure it's being done the way it's intended. If you are doing an intervention maybe 2 times a week and they're not showing growth, maybe we need to intensify. Maybe we need to go one-on-one. So instead of a group of 4, this student really needs intense intervention. We're going to do a group of 1. We're going to do a one-on-one intervention, and we might increase how long and how often we meet with that student. And then you just keep progress monitoring. And then over some more time, if it's a persistent limited growth, that might be a red flag to say, okay, we have tried, we've done our interventions with fidelity, we have intensified, the student is still not making progress. This is a point where you might want to start looking at, would they qualify for some sort of special services? I would be very cautious, and I want to be very clear to people. Tier 3 is not special education. So tier 3 is not equivalent to special education. We have students who are in an IEP that can also receive tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, that maybe they qualify in reading for an IEP, but they don't qualify in math, but they still have some skill gaps. They might be receiving those targeted or intensive interventions. A lot of times I think people are confused and view tier 3 as special education, and it is not. I also want to say, in talking to a lot of educators, for some reason, there was the idea or the myth that if you did 6 weeks of data and progress monitoring and the student wasn't showing growth, they immediately said, okay, we're going to test them for special education. No. It takes time. And what I would say to those teachers, again, teachers are doing it out of, they feel like they're doing what is best for their student and getting them all of the help that they need. But would you want your child to be tested for special ed, qualify for special ed after 6 weeks of an intervention? It might cause you to slow down. And there's nothing wrong with being in special education and getting those supports that you need. But just know that that is something that will be ongoing, more than likely through your child or your student's entire K-12 education, because getting out of special education, although that is the goal, often does not happen. So I always caution teachers, we want to try everything that we can before we look at testing. With tier 3, we're looking at 1 to 5% of our kids. So we know you can't have one-on-one groups with 30 kids. I mean, that's not how our day's set up, nor does it make much sense. Again, biggest bang for your buck is looking at that tier 1 and seeing what all kids have access to and making sure that's really solid. All right, so we're going back to our flowers. This is an orchid. Never have I ever tried to grow one of these because these are incredibly finicky. They require a lot. They require fertilization every week or every other week. I can barely remember to water my plants, my indoor plants anyway. They have to be pruned, they have to be repotted, they have this special soil. So again, the same thing, they need the same thing that every other child or every other plant needs, but their needs are just a little bit different. Might be a little bit more intense, but the needs are still the same. I also wanted to make a note, secondary MTSS, that's a different ballgame. So if you are in the secondary world, most of the work on MTSS has been done in the elementary buildings where you can have like a win time or an intervention time, and it's a little bit easier to build it into your schedule. Secondary MTSS just looks a little bit different. So typically when you're looking at doing some sort of a screener at the secondary level, we talk about doing an early warning system, and that's the ABCs. So we're looking at attendance. We know chronic absenteeism. Those students are much more likely to drop out of school and to not complete. We look at behavior, especially suspensions. This is maybe one of the trickiest parts because it's a personal or a philosophy of the district on what or how you would track behavior, and suspensions can look very different in different schools. So that one's just a little one to be aware of. And C would be course failures. So we're looking at the number of courses that you are failing. When a secondary school looks to set something up like this, they would have to have some way to track it. And then their red flags would be, okay, this student dipped below in attendance and behaviors. Okay, we've met 2 of our criteria. We really need to intervene. What can we do? Do we need to have that check in, check out with a teacher? Do we need to have a conference with parents? How do we do that? So it just looks a little bit different at the secondary level. It's not impossible. It just looks different. So the question is, okay, Michelle, that was a lot of information. That's a lot that you can do. Time is so valuable. Where am I going to spend my time? I would say tier 1 all the way. So don't try to fix interventions. Don't try to put interventions in place if you have a weak tier 1 system. So spend your time there thinking about, what do we want our kids to know? How are we going to make sure they get that quality instruction, really good materials, and then move from there? So what I'm trying to say is, one step at a time. Don't tackle this all at once because it feels really overwhelming, but just one little step at a time and it can make a big difference. So I talked about MTSS. It can have a major impact on student achievement. It's a process, it's a framework. And now I want to talk a little bit about professional learning communities and collaboration. This is something that completely changed who I was as an educator and really has given me direction in what I was doing in the classroom and made me the best possible teacher I could be. It really truly made me the most effective teacher that I was able to be. So when we look at Hattie's research, collective teacher efficacy, so the belief that as a group and as a whole, we can have and make a big difference on students' achievement. This is the largest effect size of 1.57. So the belief and the movement forward together as a team has an incredible impact on student achievement. So I would put PLCs within that context because the entire idea behind it is that you're collaborating with students' outcomes at the forefront. So with PLCs, when we talk about PLCs, we say we want to make sure that it's equitable, that everyone has an opportunity. We provide equity for students. It doesn't matter whose class you're in. It doesn't matter what section that you got put in. Every student is going to have access to that quality instruction. I like to refer to that as like the teacher lottery. Like we don't want kids like, ooh, you got the good teacher. You're going to have a really good year in math this year. Ooh, you didn't, this provides that equity across all teachers. It is systematic. There is a way, and I'm sure many of you have heard about the 4 guiding questions of PLCs. It is a system in place. I'm a huge believer in systems, and it helps to ensure that all students are getting what they need when they need it. And finally, it is data-driven. It is focused on the outcomes of students. We focus on the learning, not the teaching. And we use that to drive everything we do in our classroom. So professional learning communities, I wanted to focus on a few keywords here. This came from Rick Dufour, who is or was considered the guru of PLCs, one of the authors of Learning by Doing. And if we look at this definition of PLCs, the keywords would be collaboration. We're looking at best practice, continuously improving, and our focus is on results. So if any of this sounds familiar, it's because it's very, very similar to what we just talked about with the MTSS system. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about PLCs and then how they connect so well together. So our essentials in PLCs, when you have a professional learning community, the focus is on learning, not teaching. So gone are the days where I start on page 1, I end on page, I don't know, whatever page I get to in May, and I hope they learned it. We no longer look and say, well, I taught it, they didn't learn it, they should have paid attention. What were they doing? We're really focused on student learning and making sure that they're getting all of the concepts that they need to move forward. We have a culture of collaboration. We know everything. It's just better when you have someone else to do it with. And it also, if you think about, especially in schools where we have multiple sections, is it equitable if we have one teacher who values learning facts over another teacher who values maybe flexible thinking in math? I mean, how is that equitable when we have two different ways of teaching and presenting when we could be working together to ensure students are getting the best of the best, regardless of who the teacher is? So we're really looking at that culture of collaboration. And finally, we're looking at results driven. It's no longer what is the input, it's now the output. It's no longer what did I do as a teacher, it's what did my students get. And sometimes that means you might have to reteach. I mean, as teachers, we know sometimes, wow, that did not go well, I need to go back and reteach it. There have been times I walked away from a lesson and I thought, wow, that was really good. I wish everyone could see it. I wish it was taped. And then I looked at how my students did, whether it's an exit ticket, whether it's a check in, check out, whether it's maybe we had a quick, I used to call them celebration of knowledge. If we had something and then they bombed, I thought, oh, but that was amazing. I looked really good up there. And my students didn't do well. It just, something didn't click. I needed to go back. I needed to change what I was doing. And gone are the days where you look at the kid and go, well, you should try harder. You should focus. Well, clearly they didn't get it the first time. So it's more about the outputs and less about the inputs. So the guiding questions of our PLC. So this is the process. You're sitting down, you're with your group, and you're going through these 4 questions. Much like MTSS, you can't tackle all the tiers of MTSS at one time, just like you cannot tackle all the guiding questions of PLCs at one time. It's overwhelming. And it's a sure way to make you feel frustrated. But we'll go through them and then we'll talk about maybe where would be the best place to start. So first question we ask, what is it we want students to know? Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. That's something I often think about. We want to be crystal clear, in the words of Mike Matos, crystal clear about what we want students to know. We as teachers need to be crystal clear, and our students need to be crystal clear on what we want them to know. We know that the curriculum, the state standards in general, are an inch deep and a mile wide. You can't get through them all. There's just no possible way. So in a PLC and in that collaborative group, you sit down and have the discussions and you think about what are those standards that have a lot of leverage? What are the standards that our students need in order to move on and be successful at the next grade level? And those are the ones we're going to spend our time on. We used to say, we're going to teach it till the cows come home. Like, this is the hill that I am just going to be on. And then there's other ones that aren't nearly as important. It does not mean we don't teach them. It means that we don't teach them to the same extent we would teach what we consider maybe a priority standard. And we often refer to them as a priority, something that we're going to teach till the cows come home, and supporting something that the kids need to be exposed to it, and it's important, but it's okay if they don't have complete mastery. Some people call them essential standards. We, as a school, have decided not to do it because the opposite of essential is non-essential, and then it makes it sound like you don't have to do it at all. So we went with priority and supporting. The second question, how will we know if they have learned it? So we want to be clear on what we want them to know. How will we know if they've learned it? This is typically where we start talking about a common formative assessment. And I know people get a little worried when they hear assessment. It's not meant to be, 10 pages long. We have an assessment every week. A CFA can look very simple. It can look very different, but common is common. So if you're working, maybe there's a group of 3 people working and they're doing a common formative assessment, they should be giving that same assessment to ensure that the rigor and the depth match the standard. And then you have something to compare in a way that can improve your teaching and what you're doing with students. It is never intended to be a way to compare teachers, but a way to compare maybe those strategies that were used with students. I always like to tell people, so as I said at the beginning, I was 2018 Nebraska Teacher of the Year. Okay, so I feel like I'm pretty good teacher in the classroom, I would think. I hope so, right? So we were doing some math, and I decided, it was the second semester, and I decided I'm going to differentiate. I'm going to do small groups. I'm going to have stations. They're going to be kind of moving around. I'm going to be working with groups. This is going to be amazing. And it was going really well. And we get to the end of the year and we take a final assessment. It did not go well. It did not go well. And I looked across the hall and my teaching partner had great outcomes. And I had to look at myself and say, it doesn't mean I'm a bad teacher. I had the best of intentions, but the results are the results and it didn't work. So I either need to tweak it and change it, or I'm going to walk myself right across the hall and I'm going to ask my teaching partner, what did you do? How come your kids did so well and my kids didn't do well on that? So it's having that trust and that openness to become better at your craft and knowing that by being open, it improves your opportunities and improves your student achievement. So once we know what we're very clear on what we want them to know, we're clear on how we're going to assess them. Now we have all this data. And again, if you're going to collect data, we might as well use the data, right? We don't want it to just sit in a pile. So we need to look at it and think, what are we going to do if our students didn't learn it? And what are we going to do if they did learn it? This is the age-old question. I have like maybe 4 that didn't get it and the other 16 did. Oh, what am I going to do? How am I going to address that? Or vice versa. I have 4 that got it and 16 that didn't. So the question that you're asking as you collaborate is, what are we going to do for those who get it and don't? And that's typically where we start talking about an intervention, or it could be a reteach in this case, where we address those skills or pieces that they may not have full proficiency over. So how does this fit with MTSS and what is the connectedness? So when I look at the MTSS triangle, I immediately think, Tier 1 sounds an awful lot like, what do we want students to know? How will we know if they know it? What am I going to be teaching them? How do I know it's quality instruction? And when I look at Tier 2, I think, what do I do if they didn't learn it? And what do I do if they did learn it? That's where I start doing those targeted interventions. I should have said earlier, targeted interventions can be for those students who are struggling, but it can also be those high flyers when we look and we think, what am I going to do with this little boy who's doing algebra in 3rd grade? What am I going to do? That's where we need some sort of a targeted intervention for him as well. So I think something to point out, MTSS system and PLCs go hand in hand, but they're a little bit different. The nuances are just slightly different. So when I think of multi-tiered systems of support, they're typically addressing learning gaps that are created over time. Usually you're saying, okay, they're not, our Tier 1 is that grade level standard, they're not meeting it. What do I need to do? What gaps should I fill to help them meet that grade level standard? Versus the PLCs, which are addressing that current learning gap. So we were maybe talking about multiplication and we gave the CFA, I got a chunk that don't know it and a chunk that do. Okay, now I'm going to address, that's a current learning gap. So, but they play in together in that those conversations at a PLC are just as important and valuable, and you can move them into that MTSS framework. So it's a process and a framework that work hand in hand. So here's my question to you, Cindy. Why are teachers leaving? Why do we have a problem with teacher retention? I know you're the guru. This is your area.
Well, it might depend a little bit on the teacher, the circumstance, the school environment, but generally speaking, there's a lot that falls under this category, but it's burnout and dissatisfaction. And what that means for each teacher might be slightly different, but it tends to be around workload, increase in expectations without support or lack of support. And that might mean even a different thing for a different person. For one person, it might mean lack of parental involvement and support or a lot of criticism. Another, it might mean they need more paraeducator support or more special education support. So I would say what happens a lot of the time, teachers will say pay is about number 3 on the list. And we typically know what we're getting paid when we're a teacher. That's pretty clear. We're not trying to get rich, right? But what happens is the stress level begins to outweigh the pay, meaning it's one thing to know what you're getting paid, but it's another then to have this much stress for this little pay. And that's where we're at, is that the stress since the pandemic has continued to increase. In fact, there was just an article that came out that said there was a slight dip in stress level for teachers last year, and now it's back up again. And I think that's challenging. I think one of the other issues is that and one of the things that I'm trying to highlight is that we have had a lot of focus on those coming into the profession. We've done a lot, if you want to talk about interventions, we've tried a lot of different interventions around even getting more young people interested in teaching from even starting in high school, or providing paraeducators incentives to get certification, which are all great. Those are all great things. Paid student teaching experiences, wonderful. I mean, who would have thought that would be important, right? I mean, all of those are really important. But what we haven't done in addition to that is really focus on the other end, which is why are people leaving at a higher rate than they used to? And I'm not talking just leaving a school. I'm talking leaving the profession altogether, because they're still doing both. And both leaving, and then I think the leavers and the movers is what they call it. The leavers leave the profession, movers might move to a different building. Both of those impact student learning, because you're essentially having to start over at a different building. Even if you're still in education, there's different expectations, different colleagues, different students, different culture. So I think those things are really important. And I think the way that this helps in thinking about how we can problem solve together, what we know does help people is if they have a close connection with their colleagues at work. So PLCs are optimal when you have people who are really good at collaborating. I think what happens, and I guess what I was going to ask you, so I mean, they really, that is an element that builds a foundation for people wanting to stay at their job, because you can tend, I mean, we know that a bad supervisor really has an impact on whether or not people want to be in a building. But if you're the only one that thinks the supervisor's horrible, that's a different thing than everybody thinking the supervisor's horrible, right? There's some sort of I mean, whether or not it's good or bad, but you have a companionship in kind of working together, maybe with somebody that's not a great leader, other than being on your own. But I was going to ask you, how do you deal with what I know happens, because I've heard teachers say they even had to leave jobs because of this, where they didn't have a team that they could collaborate with, where it was dysfunctional and there was no effort to fix it. And and I mean, I've experienced this myself, where it doesn't get fixed. And so it's awful. And it makes people want to just stay in their room and try and deal with whatever they've got. What do you do with that?
Well, and that's a really good point. I had the opportunity to work in a very strong, supportive PLC. So my view and my lens of PLCs is very positive, and it helped me to grow as a teacher. I have seen dysfunctional PLCs. I would say part of that falls on, it needs to be the leader or the supervisor addressing the problem. It cannot be, that's how they always are. Oh, so-and-so, they don't like to collaborate. I mean, there has to be, this is the expectation. And if you're not rising to it, then you might want to find somewhere else to go. I mean, some of that just falls onto their supervisor. And if their supervisor isn't doing that, it's tough to perform in a PLC, Cindy. And I don't know if there's a way to fix it unless you can try to find collaborative partners in a different school, in a different grade level, maybe in a different district, but the same grade level. That's probably but I think a lot of that falls on to the administrator to be able to set the expectation. I also wanted to say, oftentimes, like with PLCs and even MTSS, initially when you start it, sometimes it just feels like a checklist and something to do. So when we first started PLCs, it was everyone has to take notes. You have to have an agenda. You have to fill it in. It was like, it's just another step. But I will say it then led to the process becoming very innate. And eventually it was less about the agenda and more about the rich conversations. But to ensure those conversations and processes were happening, we had to have some sort of an agenda to follow at first. But you don't want to live there. That's an initial implementation. That is not a long-term impactful implementation. It's just to get you started. And then, like I said, like everything I do, whether it's teaching or even now as I work with adults, what do I want them to know? How will I know if they know it? And then how can I use that information to impact either what I'm doing next with those same learners or what I'm going to do with my next set of learners? So it's just a cycle that it becomes a part of what you do as a teacher.
So one thing that I saw on your slide around PLCs was the mention of parents. And to be honest, I've never seen that implemented with parents. Can you describe ways that you've seen that? Because that is unique.
It is very unique. My experience with PLCs, we didn't have parents necessarily in with us, but I do think it just sharpens the conversations you're having with parents, and you are very, very clear about what is happening in the classroom.
I see. So they're
Right.
not like necessarily in the planning session, but you're including
Correct.
them as a valuable partner
As a
in the
valuable, yes, because your
process.
communication is so much better because you can be
Yeah,
very explicit about,
this is
you
what they
know,
need. Yeah.
yep, and this is how we're providing it. And I think about if you have multiples in a grade level and we had triplets one year, all in a different class. I would hope those three are all, I mean, they should be getting the same type of education. Now, my classroom management style, very different from the teaching partners, and that's totally fine. But the content I'm covering, my expectations, the assessments and the rigor, the same.
Yeah.
That's not what moves. It's you can still put your own stamp on it. I know some people get worried about, well, that takes away the creativity. No, you still get to do that. But these are the things we're going to hold tight to.
So when you said you were talking about different interventions, and I do believe I might be, well, I am a little older than you, and I do think that when some of this was implemented initially, there was this expectation that there was a certain amount of time that
Mhm.
you had to do an intervention before someone could be tested for. I have heard that, and it didn't originate from me. So I think that teachers still doing that probably heard the same things I did back 30
Mhm.
years ago.
Right.
But I'm wondering how, when you talk about interventions, and I taught kindergarten, first and second grade, and there wasn't a lot of support as far as paraeducator support, where
Mhm.
it would be really easy for me to build in one-on-one, or I had opportunities for small groups, that was fine, but
Mhm.
one-on-one became a real challenge.
Mhm.
How do you help people? How do people do that?
Well, I think a lot of the one-on-one, those intensive interventions, a lot of schools have interventionists now. They
Okay.
literally push in and that's what they do. A lot of paras. Now, we wouldn't have paras do that one-on-one intervention for obvious reasons. We have title teachers that would do that. I think the expectation would be targeted groups they seem manageable to a classroom teacher. The one-on-one group is probably not going to be a classroom teacher unless they have something else set up where the other students in the class can work on something else.
Right.
But it's typically, I see that as a push-in person, be it title, interventionist, somebody else that's supporting.
Okay. I mean, the other option would be you're, at a small group and you're just one-on-one, working with
Right.
each individual differently, but in a small group. So,
Right. But
I
that's
mean,
still different because it's hard to look at that and look at the data and say,
right.
this wasn't successful. Well, I was also trying to help Johnny while three other people were sick,
Right.
So
It does become questionable on the fidelity side,
yes, yes.
but that
But
is
it's also
part of the
reality.
correct. I was going to say fidelity is sort of the challenge of all teaching, right?
Mhm.
Because you can be teaching the same thing I'm teaching, but you didn't have, you know, Sue throw up on the carpet when you were teaching and I did. So the lesson looked a little different in my classroom that day. And so it does make it challenging. I do think, and you didn't talk about this so much, but I'm curious, not to put you on the spot, but where are we with pacing guides in practice?
In practice. So I've been out of the classroom for 3 years. Prior to that, my experience with pacing guides, well, my personal experience with my own children, I remember having a problem when my oldest was in kindergarten. She just came home bawling one day. And what is wrong? Mom, I don't like math. I don't like math. And I talked to the teacher, and the teacher's like, well, we have to be on page 15 on this day, page 16 on this day, page 17 on this day. Okay. Not the intention of a pacing guide. So the way it was approached in my PLC, we had a guide, and that's just what it was. It was a guide. And the understanding is, let's say we're doing a unit on addition with regrouping. We would set a time when we would like to be done, and then it would be give or take some days.
Mhm.
So if I'm done on Friday and my teaching partner is done on the next Wednesday, that's great. That's absolutely fine. Her students may have needed a couple more days, but it's still valuable to look at that data together to then look at kids and what they need and to be able to sort out their needs. But if I'm done on a Friday and my teaching partner is done in 3 weeks, now we have a bit of a problem because we can't look at all that data together, and we can't use our human resources and our time resource the most effectively by grouping kids. So I think pacing guides are great as a guideline. Like it should never be a lockstep, must be on this page, be in trouble if you're not. I don't think that's the purpose of it. I think the purpose is to be able to have those conversations-ish around the
Yes.
same time-ish.
Yeah. And it is a bit like your scope and sequence, but with some, I don't want to say deadlines, but at least with some dates included.
Yeah, with some parameters.
Yeah, some parameters. There you go.
But I
That's good.
think it helps because it will prompt people. Sometimes you get stuck and you're thinking they're not getting it, they're not getting it, and you could drag a unit on for another month when we need to stop, we need to move on. We have to trust that we're going to be able to come back and kind of work in some of those skills. So I think it
I
just
see. Okay.
it kind of keeps teachers moving and not getting too stuck,
I
but
see.
it should never be lockstep, have to do this date.
So you're saying, sometimes there might be teachers that are, they do have to stop because they've had, for whatever reason, needing to reteach or a lot more intervention than someone else. And they might have to skip a book that's, or a story that's listed, but maybe the skills that were embedded in that lesson need to be moved forward to the future in some
Yes.
capacity. But we're not just going to say, oh, I'm sorry, I have to, we have to all read this book or
this curriculum
yeah.
isn't going to trump the content or the standards moving
Correct.
forward. Like,
yeah.
Yes. And sometimes it's like, I can't move on until everybody gets it. I can't move on until everybody gets it. Well, what are we going to do for those students who already got it? So
right.
that's why we do have to move on, and we pull out those small groups to help support.
And your pacing guides, did they outline more what the learning outcomes were or what the curriculum parameters were, or both?
Standards.
Okay.
It focused more on the standards.
Standards. That's the difference, I think, than some of what I've heard in the past, which was you need to be done with this curriculum. I mean, I think it focused more on the curriculum than on the learning.
Yes. And there's the teaching versus learning focus.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not coverage anymore.
Right. But wasn't that how it was first sort of? Okay. So I'm not just pulling that out of the air.
No.
I remember these, it's been a while since I was in the classroom, but I remember this as well coming out. And I remember a lot of teachers being concerned. And as a parent, it also didn't make much sense to me. And I do feel like I was teaching in an era where there wasn't a lot of curriculum to support. Like I didn't get to open a book and have the objectives, the outcomes, the activities all laid out. Like I had to literally come up with these things, which I'm not saying that's great either, right? Somewhere in the middle between very prescribed and free for all, which is a bit like I taught, there's probably a really good place to be. But I have seen some teachers teach so much to the curriculum that they forget about the learning or even teaching. It's just the curriculum says to do this, the curriculum says to do that. Well, you're a professional. I mean, I felt like it's taken some of the professionalism out of teaching.
And I would agree with that. I think some of that comes from administrators. So if you have administrators saying, you will do every piece of this, we purchased this curriculum, you will do every piece.
Yeah.
It could be a time where this could be something you collaborate on. So for example, you might have the greatest math curriculum, but you cannot get it done in the 60 minutes that you have. So as a team, you're going to come together and say, okay, what are the key components that our students need? And what are the pieces that we might take out? Because sometimes I feel like curriculums throw everything but the kitchen sink in, and you can't get through it all. Right. But again, we want to make sure that we're hitting those points that tie. That's why it's be very clear on what you want your students to know. Align everything you're doing with that.
Yeah.
And if that's your anchor, you can't go wrong. And if you're talking in your groups together, then you're all going to be having those same pieces pulled out, as opposed to, I really like this piece. I love doing number talks. Those are so fun. And your teaching partner might say, oh, I hate recording that. I don't know how to record their ideas. I don't want to do that. And now we've lost a piece. So as a professional, I think it's important that teams sit down, and if there's just too much in a curriculum, you're able to sit down. And now it can't just be what do you like and not like. It has to be
right. What doesn't.
Right. But
not for you. Right?
Exactly. Yes. Again, student learner focused, but sometimes it does come down to your administrators. And that's really hard because sometimes that's when you feel like you don't have control and you have to do every aspect of it. I wish I knew a way to fix that, but I don't.
Well, if you did, you'd be making millions. So
I know.
Well, Michelle, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy teaching schedule. I mean, I know you've been working all day, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this. This was really helpful. I know for me, I think it might also be helpful for others that aren't as familiar with, I'm hoping maybe parents or maybe some school board members also learn a little bit from this because I think it's very valuable. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your expertise. Oops, hang on. I put my, okay.
Thank you for having me, Cindy. I could talk for days on PLCs and MTSS. I'm very passionate about them.
Well, I mean, that probably means you're in the right place. So that's great. Well, if you have questions about PLCs and MTSS, Michelle's your contact for that, not me. So here's your contact information. Thank you so much. I just want to say I've known Michelle since she was the Nebraska Teacher of the Year. I believe that's when we first met. Always so impressed with you. We've stayed in touch since then. I can't believe it's really been that long. It seems kind of weird. And, we've all been there where we've had different job situations occur, different environments, different cultures. And I am glad that you are where you are. And I hope that, you move forward in the future in a similar fashion, because I think this is where you're meant to be. So before we finish up here, I'm going to share.
Yep.
Okay, so my name is Cindy Copich, and these webinars are an opportunity once a month for everyone to get together and learn. And I will share with you a little bit. Here's my contact information. I focus specifically on retention and recruitment and help school districts with those issues. As with Michelle, you have your area of focus and I have mine, and it really is around teacher retention. And thanks yet again. So we will get this video up on YouTube. So check that out. I believe the channel's coachingconfidant.com, and I will stop. So thank you so much, Michelle.